This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today is Monday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to look at blue 2-drop creatures. Last week, I took a look at red 2-drops, and I'm planning on getting around to looking at every color, so it made sense to continue this week with blue. When you think about blue, you probably don't think that much about them having great 2-drops, but we're actually going to see that this list is far more stacked than the red 2-drop list was. Blue 2-drops on average aren't quite as aggressive as what we saw in red, but there are a lot of blue 2-drops that deliver a lot of impressive value for their cost. To be eligible for this list, a card had to be a mono blue creature with a mana value of 2. In all, there are 391 blue 2-drops, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, it is Gilded Drake. This 2-mana 3/3 flyer might look aggressive at first, but the card's good stats are actually something of a downside to balance out the fact that you can trade your Gilded Drake for one of your opponent's creatures. So your opponent does end up with something pretty nice. Of course, what you're going to end up with when you play the Gilded Drake is always better, otherwise you won't be playing it. It didn't see play in Standard or Block, but it did see play in a lot of extended sideboards. It was mostly relegated to sideboards because of the fact that a card like this isn't going to be very good against aggro decks. Generally, you're going to be getting a worse creature than the Drake against them. However, it is great against decks that go big with creatures. It did see some main deck play as a one of an extended where it could be tutored up by survival of the fittest in situations where the Drake would be at its best. It didn't see any play between 2005 and 2012, but in 2012 it re-emerged in Legacy, where it's a particularly powerful card against decks that like to cheat creatures into play with reanimation or show and tell, since you can get something like an opposing Gristlebrand in exchange for your Gilded Drake. It's still seeing play in Legacy these days, and it's likely to keep gaining points. It's just really good against one of the most prominent strategies in that format. At number 9, it is Rattlechains. This 2-mana 2/1 flyer comes with Flash, gives all your spirits Flash, and gives a spirit hexproof until end of turn when it enters the battlefield. That's a ton for only 2 mana, especially when the baseline is a nicely aggressive 2-drop. Obviously enough Rattlechains sees play in spirit decks, which can take advantage of all of this upside. These are powerful tribal decks that can operate at instant speed thanks to cards like Rattlechains. It's been played in Spirit decks in Standard, Pioneer, and Modern, and it's going to keep gaining points. At number 8, it is Tidebinder Mage. This 2-mana 2/2 taps down a red or green creature and keeps it from untapping for a turn when it enters the battlefield. While it might look like it would mostly be a sideboard card, it has actually gained the majority of its points in the main deck. It has something to tap down more often than you might think, but even when it doesn't have a target to tap down, the decks that have played the Mage still get value out of it. For example, in Standard it was played in Devotion to Blue, where the Mage was really good for raising your devotion early. It also sees play in Modern and Vintage Merfolk, where its creature type is really important. It's gaining points rather slowly at this point, but it will probably still do enough to remain on this list. At number 7, it is Lord of Atlantis. The Lord is as old as the game of Magic itself, as it was originally printed in Alpha. It's a 2-mana 2/2 that gives all Merfolk +1/+1 an Island Walk, so it's no secret the kind of deck you want to play it in. Merfolk decks first emerged on the competitive scene in 1998, and they have never really gone away. The Lord has put up points in every single Magic format it's ever been legal in, and it's usually a crucial card for Merfolk decks. It offers a super efficient boost to your whole board, and oftentimes Merfolk decks run ways to turn opposing lands into islands, so your Merfolk are often unblockable too. Merfolk decks continue to be relevant in multiple formats, and Lord of Atlantis is going to keep going along for the ride. If you're interested in learning more about the long history of Merfolk decks, which were the game's first tribal decks, I did an entire episode of my deck history series covering them. At number 6, it is Ledger Shredder, the newest card on the list, and by a fairly wide margin, so it's pretty impressive it's already this high. The Shredder is a 2-mana 1/3 flyer that connives anytime any player casts their second spell in a turn. This means it both rewards you for playing multiple spells and punishes your opponent for playing multiple spells. Connive is a pretty powerful effect too, as it lets you draw a card and discard a card, something that's always pretty great, but it adds some additional modality. If you discard a non-land card, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on the Shredder. This can allow it to rip through your deck while making the Shredder into a very real threat. This is especially powerful when you're discarding cards that you can get value out of even after you discard them. It can be particularly spicy in Pioneer and Modern Arclight Phoenix decks, which want to discard the Phoenix and cast lots of spells. So obviously the Shredder is a great fit. Ledger Shredder is already a multi-format all-star, having gained points in Tempo decks in Standard, Historic, Pioneer, Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and it is likely to continue to climb up this list in the future. At number 5, it is Thing in the Ice. This 2-mana 0/4 with Defender is pretty unsuspecting at first, but once you cast enough instants and sorceries to put 4 ice counters on it, it transforms into Awoken Horror, which immediately bounces all non-horror creatures to their owner's hand. This of course means the Awoken Horror itself is unaffected. All in all, that's some pretty insane value for only 2 mana, even if you have to do a little bit of work. Thing in the Ice is of course right at home in spell decks in a variety of formats, as it provides a very real win condition, and it can even block reasonably well early. In Standard, Thing in the Ice was primarily played in Izzet control decks, but it didn't find a ton of success in the format. Thing in the Ice has seen play in Modern pretty much from the day it was printed, appearing in various decks with other powerful spell payoffs like Young Pyromancer. It's also played in Arclight Phoenix decks in both Modern and Pioneer. It even sees some play in Vintage control decks. It's going to keep gaining points in Modern, Vintage, and Pioneer. However, it isn't ultra likely to catch up to the things on the list in front of it, all of which also have a lot of points and are continuing to see play. At number 4, it is Thassa's Oracle. This 2-mana 1/3 lets you look at the top X cards of your library, where X is your devotion to blue. Then you put one of those cards on top of your library and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, so it can give you some pretty good card selection. But most importantly, if your devotion to blue is greater than the number of cards left in your library, you win the game. I didn't see any play in Standard, but in Magic's other formats, the Oracle quickly proved to be a powerful win condition in decks that could find ways to quickly shrink the library. Pioneer was the format where it first showcased its power, which it did alongside Inverter of Truth. The Inverter could shrink your library by switching it for your graveyard, allowing the Oracle's Enter the Battlefield ability to win the game. This combo ultimately got the Inverter banned in the format. It's continued to see some play since the ban, particularly in landless spy decks, which can mill the entire library before casting the Oracle. It quickly required a ban in Historic 2, where it could be combined with Tainted Pact for an easy win. In Modern, it's gained a few points in Ad Nauseam decks, which generally seek to draw their entire library in a single turn, which means the Oracle is very easy to win with. It has more recently found more consistent success in Modern in Grinding Station decks, which look to mill their entire library and get tons of value out of doing so with Underworld Breach. Once you've milled enough of your deck, you can cast the Oracle from your graveyard and win the game. It's also been very successful in Legacy and Vintage, where it's combined with Doomsday, which lets you search up 5 cards and exile the rest of your library, and you get to put those cards back in the order you want them to be. Obviously, this can easily set up an Oracle win. Like Ledger Shredder, Thassa's Oracle is likely to continue to gain points in the future. At number 3, it is Jace Vryn's Prodigy. If you thought Thing in the Ice was an impressive card for 2 mana, you might be even more impressed here, since this is a 2-mana Planeswalker. Eventually, anyway. This double-face card represents the moment when Jace became a Planeswalker, so on the front he's a 2-mana 0/2 creature who can tap to loot. Part of that ability checks to see if there are 5 or more cards in your graveyard, and if there are, he transforms. Once transformed, he's Jace Telepath Unbound, who has a +1 that makes a creature get -2/-0 until your next turn, a -3 that lets you cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard, and a -9 that gives you an emblem that lets you mill 5 cards from an opponent's library every time you cast a spell. Jace has been particularly well suited to decks that can quickly load the graveyard and transform him. He also goes pretty well in any deck that's interested in casting cheap spells. He was played a ton in Standard control decks, and he's also found success in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage Delver decks. Like some other cards on the list, he also goes great with Arclight Phoenix. He's gained points in Pioneer decks like Dimir Inverter and Dimir Control. Jace is likely to keep gaining points going forward, and he isn't too far behind the number 2, so they could switch spots in the future. For now though, the number 2 card is Phantasmal Image. The image is an incredibly efficient clone. For only 2 mana, it can enter the battlefield as a copy of any one of your creatures. Chances are pretty good you get something worth that much mana, or more, when you play it. It does come with the downside that balances it some, since if it gets targeted by anything, you have to sacrifice it. The image has been used the most in various tribal decks over the years, because it can count as additional copies of your important lords. It's preferred over some other clones because it costs way less mana. In Standard, it was copying Lord of the Unreal and Illusion decks, which was pretty sweet because it meant both your lords would have hexproof. It's been used to copy lots of Merfolk lords, like Lord of the Atlantis we saw earlier, in Modern Legacy and Vintage, and it's done the same sort of thing in Modern Humans and Modern Spirits. In those decks, many of the creatures also have powerful enter the battlefield abilities, and when it comes into play as one of them, you get that trigger. The image is going to keep gaining points going forward, but it is doing so at a much slower rate than Jace right now, so I think Jace might pass it in the future. However, the number 1 card on the list is probably going to hold on to its slot forever, and that card is Snapcaster Mage, which has almost 200 more points than Phantasmal Image. The Mage is a 2-mana 2/1 with Flash that gives flashback to an instant or sorcery in your graveyard until end of turn. Because the Snapcaster has Flash, this means you can give an instant in your graveyard flashback and then cast it. This is especially potent with counter magic, but really getting to cast any instant or sorcery from your graveyard is a great deal, especially because you're also getting a 2-mana 2/1. Snapcaster usually shows up in control decks, and it isn't completely unheard of for a Snapcaster deck to just win the game with this little 2-mana 2/1 as an attacker. Snapcaster Mage has seen play in every format it's been legal in. Basically, blue control decks in all of Magic's formats have featured Snapcaster Mage and continue to feature Snapcaster Mage, so it's very likely to continue to be number 1 on this list, even with the other cards behind it still seeing a ton of play. So, those are the top 10 blue 2-drops. If you want to own any of these powerful creatures, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for every card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on the more than 550 other MTG Top 10s, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.